The Torah tells us on Pasuk Beis, the Yovu Avram Lispel the son of Kosa. He had come to eulogize her and to cry on her behalf, or because of her passing. So the obvious question is, the moment he comes and he realizes his wife passes away, there's no question he cried. But yet the order is, Lispel, first he eulogized her, then he cried. Seemingly he should have cried and then you eulogized her. So the simple understanding is that there's no question a person is confronted with a tragedy. He's overwhelmed, he cries. Why does a person cry? A person cries from pain and a person cries from joy. The body has a certain capacity. If it goes beyond the capacity the body is able to deal with on an emotional level, whether it's positive or negative, the result of that are tears. You can have tears of joy, or one, God forbid, could have tears of pain, of sorrow. When the pain is overwhelming, that means you can't deal with the issue because it's so overwhelming that causes one to cry. Or the joy is so overwhelming that the person emotionally does not have the capacity to deal with that level of joy, that evokes tears of joy. There's no question, Avram comes back, he hears his partner in life passes away, he cries. But he feels that loss. He feels part of him is no longer there. When a person says the hesped, when a person eulogizes a person, the person is defining what exactly the loss is. It's not my partner's no longer here. You're evaluating and focusing on every detail and aspect of that person by identifying the person. Now you can evaluate and appreciate what the loss was. So the crying afterwards is a different crying than before. One is a person's overwhelmed with loss. The second crying, which we're discussing here, which is much more specific and more, it's taking inventory. It's evaluating and understanding where you're not any longer, that only follows the eulogy. Because the eulogy allows the person to articulate and understand who the person was. And since that person is no longer here, what that person represents, that there's a void. And because that void, that's the reason why the person cries. But there's no question, Avram, when he first comes back, of course he cried. But it's a different level of, qualitatively, it's a different level of crying. I always mentioned the Ksav Sofer. The base and Lifkosa is a smaller base. Now the question is, why is it smaller? So seemingly it indicates that normally he would have cried to a greater degree. There was a certain minimalization in the crying. There was a holdback. Now the question is, why was there holdback? If he eulogized her, as we're saying now, when he really understood what no longer exists, if you take a look in the Midrash, the last chapter in Mishlei, which is Eishes Chayil, which we say on Friday night, Eishes Chayil, according to the Midrash, is speaking about Sarah Imenu. She is the ultimate woman of valor. And everything that's articulated describes her, that's Sarah Imenu. So if that's who she is, the person should be crying overwhelmingly. And yet the Torah writes the base to indicate that there was a minimalization of this crying. There's some kind of holdback, and he didn't cry as a person normally would cry when a person loses its kind of wife. That's the question. So over here, before I tell you what the Ksav Sofer says, the Balaturim says, he cried to a lesser degree because she was old. She was old. Why did she pass away now? The Gemara tells us, besides the Gemara, that a person who demands divine justice in another person, which is midas adin, the midas adin is brought upon that person. Because if you feel that you have a right to demand the other person should be judged precisely and accurately with that level of definiteness, evidently, if you're setting the yardstick for that other person, you deserve to be evaluated on the same level. So when Sari Menu, when she was mistreated by her maidservant, Hagar, and she said to Avram Avinu, Chamosi Alecho, my anger is directed towards you. Then she said, Yishvot Hashem Beini V'Necho. God should judge between myself and yourself. God should judge you. So she evoked divine justice on Avram Avinu. So because she evoked that justice on Avram Avinu, there she was subject to that level of evaluation, and that's why she passed away early. So because over here she was the cause of her own death, that's the reason why there's a minimalization of the cry for that reason. Because she caused it herself, she brought it upon herself. That's why the base is small. You know, it's still difficult. I mean, the Gemara says this. The Gemara says she brought, doesn't say that's why he cried less or more. That's what the Balaturim is saying. Because she brought it upon herself, therefore, the crying was to a lesser degree. I mean, what is one thing up to another? The person, God forbid, makes a mistake or does something, and the person experiences that loss. I mean, the tragedy is so overwhelming. You would have cried more, it's only because of this. You cried less. I mean, the person still beside himself. Okay? But that's the Balatura. But it's interesting. What was one of the interpretations over there is, why was it Chamosi Alecha? Firstly, she said, one interpretation is, when you see the maid servant dealing with me disrespectfully, you should have reined in on her. And because you did not, Hashem should judge you. That's the first shot, the first interpretation. The other, he says, when you prayed that you should have a child, but it's clear you didn't pray for me, because if you would have prayed for me, I would have also conceived. So therefore, I'm upset with you that you did not pray for me. Therefore, divine justice should be upon you. That's the second interpretation Rashi says over there. Now, the second is what to talk about. Now, why did Avram not conceive a child at that time from Sarai Menu? Avram was only qualified to father a child from Sarah. Sarah was the matriarch. And that child was the future patriarch, and is the future of Jewish people. Avram had to be circumcised before he was able to father a child from Sarai Menu. It had nothing to do with praying or not praying. The reason why he was able to have a child from Hagar, because Hagar's child is not the future of the Jewish people. He didn't have to have a certain degree of qualification. He was sufficiently spiritually advanced, worthy to have a child. So when he prayed, he had a child from Hagar. However, from Sarai Menu, it had nothing to do with what he prayed or didn't pray. He could have prayed from then forever until he was at a level that he was qualified to be circumcised. He could have fathered the child. Sarai Menu didn't know this. The reason why did Sarai Menu chuckle and she questioned whether she was skeptical whether she was going to have a child? Because she left no stone unturned, and she did every level of hishtadlus, every level of initiative, and the answer is the way she's not having a child. So all of a sudden now she hears she's having a child, she was like taken aback, and therefore that was the degree of skepticism. But the reason why she didn't have the child, it's not because she wasn't worthy until then. It had nothing to do with her personal worthiness. It had to do with Avram. She didn't know that. As a result of that, when she said, Yishman Hashem Beini V'Necho, you should have prayed for me, therefore I have a claim against you, and divine justice should come upon you, it's a baseless claim. And because it's a baseless claim, therefore you're held accountable for that. That's why there was that level of culpability to Sarai Menu, because you're coming with a demand and a claim at that level, which it's a baseless claim. When she chuckled, she said, "Vadon is okay. My master is old. My master is old." And Hashem went and altered what she had said, and she said, "Ani zakati. I am old. I am old." Now, why did she say Adon? So, why did she say Adon is okay? Because she said, even though Hagar was a young woman, she could conceive, but if the man is too old, he can't father the child. So why were you able to father the child? Because it was a miracle. But why did you merit that miracle, even though you were old? Because you prayed for yourself. You prayed for yourself. You prayed for yourself that you could have the child, even though despite your old age. So why don't you pray for me? That's a claim. So this Adoni, so now when she hears she's gonna have a child, right? But Adoni's okay. Evidently, him being old is not enough for her to have a child. That was the point in her mind. When he prayed despite he's old, he's gonna have a child from this young woman. So if that's the case, now when she thinks in her mind, he didn't pray despite his old age, she could have a child from me. But the emphasis was on that he's old. Therefore, in her mind, what was etched in her mind was, my husband's too old to father a child. Why was he able to have a child from Hagar? Because he prayed for himself. But he didn't pray for me that he could have a child from me despite his old age. So she said, Adoni's okay. But Hashem didn't share that with Avraham Avinu for the sake of Shalom Bayis. And he said, Ani zakanti. She said, I'm old. That's what just came to mind. Why the focus was Adoni's okay and not Ani zakanti when she was skeptical. Tzavsov explains that Avraham Avinu's coming back from the Akedah was the greatest achievement in his life. Why was it the greatest achievement of his life? As we just explained, Satan, in the worst way, wanted to prevent this from happening. Came as a raging river. Even at the end, when the Ayil came running towards him, he actually tried to prevent the Ayil, the ram, from being caught. So Avram should concretize and actualize all his intent when he slaughtered that ram, because ultimately, if he succeeds, the merit will be at such a level that whenever Satan comes to prosecute the Jewish people, the schus of the Akedah will silence that prosecution. So Avram now, his whole total, his mind, his emotion, everything was what? Was dedicated that he will establish and address the eternity of existence and the objective of existence, which is l'chvodi barosiv. L'chvodi barosiv, I've created for my glory only if there's a Klal of Israel. But if the Jews are actually vulnerable to the prosecution of Satan, that they can be destroyed, so l'chvodi barosiv is not set permanently, is not assured. With the Akedah, it's assured. Because whatever the prosecution will be, the schus of the Akedah is so overwhelmingly great, it will silence it. So Avram is coming back ecstatic. He's at a level, he's consumed with joy. As a human being, regardless of the level of tragedy, you hear it, God forbid a person hears such a thing, such a special wife, Sari man who was one of a kind, who's greater than he in prophecy, and his part in life. But because emotionally and mentally, in every aspect of his being was totally charged at that very advanced level, to come down and have a capacity to be able to grieve as he should grieve, he wasn't able to. Humanly, it's not possible. So the base is indicating to what degree Avram valued what just happened. Because he was totally consumed with what he accomplished, therefore it was nearly impossible for him to grieve sufficiently. That's the significance of the base. So the base tells us exactly where Avram was at. That Kavod Shamayim, that God's glory surpasses anything. We find that, I mean, the Gemara, the Mishnah, this whole discussion, B'tzora Mora, the reality of the rebellious child that he's put to death and he's brought by his parents to the Bezdin, did it ever happen or not? So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, it's not possible to happen. So why does the Torah state the portion of the B'tzora Mora? Lidrus Kabul Schar, to study it and be worthy of reward for studying it. So the Rabbeinu Bachi asks, if that's the case, Mishnah says that a person says Shema, Kriya Shema after the Zman, although you're not accredited for Shema, but it's Kilu Lama Torah. He said, Psukim, you study Torah. So if it's to get to be rewarded for studying Torah, we don't have to have the narrative of the rebellious child. Just any Psukim you say, you're accredited for studying Torah. So Rabbeinu Bachi says that's not what it means. Lidrus Kabul Schar means you should study it, and as a result of the takeaway, you'll be worthy of reward. Mean there's a message. What's the message? Whoever heard of parents recognizing, realizing the child is what is doing, his behavior is not acceptable, and although he's only 13, just 13 years old, this behavior is indicative of what? That he's developing an addiction, which will lead to a life of crime, which will ultimately cause him to be a murderer. And therefore, better take him out now than wait till later. I mean, a parent, because of their love for a child, is just 13. You attribute it to his immaturity. But the Torah is attesting the fact, no, this is not immaturity, this is a real problem. If he becomes a repeat offender, this is confirmed he's developing an addiction, and ultimately he's become a murderer. The parents to be able to negate their own feelings, their own love, and suppress it, and accept what the Torah says, embrace it, it's the equivalent of the Akedah. Just the Avraham Avinu, as much as he loved this child, he suppressed that love to do the will of Hashem, because the love of Hashem superseded his love for his child. The love for Hashem, negating your mindset and your love and your feeling towards your child, for the sake of accepting what God's evaluation of this reality, it's the equivalent of the Akedah. That's Lidrus Kabul Schar. That's the takeaway. Because what's primary is the will of Hashem. So I'm saying, here he's coming back. His achievement is the ultimate. He guaranteed the objective of creation. The Jewish people now are guaranteed to be eternal. Because whatever the prosecution is, it can never bring about the destruction. So his love of Hashem is that he was able to be the one to merit, to be worthy, to bring this about, is all-consuming. Love-wise, emotion-wise, all of a sudden that way is a tragedy. He doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't resonate in the negative. He doesn't have the capacity to grieve. So that's a statement that confirms who is Avraham Avinu. This is Torah with Koso. This one, Misa Soto Akedah Sitzot. What is to juxtapose the death of Soto to the Akedah? As a result of being informed of the Akedah, that her son was in a position to be slaughtered, and he was about to be slaughtered, her soul left her and she died, because she already played out the scenario. He's bound, he's going to be slaughtered, and so she believed that Avram took the next step, actually ended his life. Vayokam Avram mi'alpnei meso v'yidaber al bnei ches lemor. It's an interesting medrash over here. If a person prays and is focused on the tefillah, he prays with kavana, you guaranteed your tefillah will be heard, will be accepted. Shenemar, based on Pasuk and Tehillim, Tochen Libo, Takshiv Osnecho, that if your heart is prepared and focused, you will have an attentive ear. Hashem will be attentive to your supplication. There was no one who was able to have this focus and this kavana like Avram Avinu. He was one of a kind. What did he say? Where do we find he prayed? Yeah. Interesting. This is called a prayer, a supplication. When he was in conversation about stone being destroyed, he said, it would be considered inappropriate if you should do that, to destroy the tzaddik with the Russia. You know, this is the point. When Hashem had seen that he was looking for a merit that the world should not be destroyed, the world should not be destroyed. So the question is, what in the world should not be destroyed? Sodom and Gomorrah is not the world, right? It was just that particular location. But they were evil. But it says when Hashem saw that he was supplicating him and looking for a merit, the world should not be destroyed, Hiskum Shalcho. Hashem began praising him, praising Avram. V'omar lo yofir fisom and neodom. It's supposed to tell him he's the most beautiful among mankind. Now, how do we understand that? He prayed the world should not be destroyed. What is it all about? If you take a look over there, he said, it's inappropriate, you should destroy tzaddikim Rosham. So what does Rashi say over there? Rashi says, what are people going to say? That when it comes to punishment, Hashem does not discern between the tzaddik and the Rosh. Just as at the time of the Dor HaMabul and the time of the Great Flood, the tzaddik perished together with the Rosha. Now, when you destroy Sodom, the tzaddik is perishing together with the Rosha. So what went back and forth? Hashem said, there's no tzaddik. Therefore, there's nothing inappropriate here. But what was the point originally? It's going to be a chil Hashem. People are going to say that Hashem doesn't discern between the tzaddik and Rosha. Meaning, life has no value. If you succeed, you fail. And if you fail, you fail. So what's the point of existence? That was Avram's claim. Now, the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, at the time of the Mabul, the tzaddikim perished during the Mabul. Gemara says yes. Why? Because the only reason why Noach survived is because Noach motzah chen b'nei Hashem. Only because he found special favor in God's eyes. Because when there's midas adin, when the attribute of justice is in place, you can't be perfect enough to be able to survive. So the Gemara said, why did Noach survive? Noach motzah chen b'nei Hashem. He found special favor in the eyes of God. But otherwise he would have perished also. So that's what Avram said to Hashem. That people are going to say, just as the Mabul, there was no discernment tzaddik and Rasha. Now, if the tzaddikim in Sodom and they perish, there's no point. There's no hope. You can't survive this existence. So what happens if that's the case? Mankind, even the tzaddikim, they turn their backs on God. And if they turn their backs on God, the world's going to be destroyed. So what was the point? It wasn't just chil Hashem. It was a point. If that people have this perspective that do good, as they say, damned if you good, damned if you no good. It's all futile. It's all futility. What's the point? If people take on that perspective, people give up hope and the world will be destroyed. So not because Sodom and Gomorrah, they are the world. But the takeaway would be everybody become disillusioned. There's no point in going further. That's the way I understand it. Hashem said, beautiful human being, Avram says, if that's the case, I have a request. Omalo, Eze Yibu Sheli. He says, what's the value of me being special? Ani ubni nechnosa liyir. I and my son, we come into a city. People, they're not able to recognize the difference between a father and a son. And though that time people would live 100, 200 years. They did not age. There was no sign of aging outwardly on the person. You have to make a differentiation, a clear discernment, recognizable between a father and a son, and a lad, a youth, and an elderly person. Why? She's kabed hazokin benar, that the elderly person should be revered and honored and respected by the young person. You hear this? Why did he want it? It wasn't only that a father should be able to be discerned from his child, and the youth should revere and give honor to the elder. Why is it so important? You know, it's interesting. The Gemara tells us in Brochus, Alan, I don't think you'd be able to quote this from the past. The Gemara says in Brochus that after Rabbi Gamliel was impeached as the prince, as the Nasi, so they decided that Rabbi Elazar ben Azari, we say this in the Haggadah, was chosen to be the Nasi. Rabbi Elazar ben Azari was only 18 years old. So there was a problem. Even though he was qualified to be the Nasi in terms of his pedigree, in terms of his knowledge, but he looked like he looked like an 18-year-old. So what happens? So the Gemara says he went to sleep, looking like a young man, and when he woke, he looked like a 70-year-old man. And therefore, Rabbi Elazar ben Azari, we say in Haggadah, I am the equivalent of a 70-year-old man, although he's only 18 years old, but he looked like a 70-year-old man. So the question is, which I asked, which everybody should ask. A day ago, he was an 18-year-old, young-looking man. Everybody knows he's the same person. But today, he has a presence of a 70-year-old. What has changed? That's the question I always ask. So the way I understand it is this way. The way one perceives somebody, if the person has a presence, a certain presence, a presence has an effect. You have a child prodigy, genie, whatever it is, he's a kid. You see him as a child, regardless of his knowledge or his ability. But in terms of respecting him, the person has to have a presence. To revere a person, it's not enough. His value, he has to have a presence. Until he has that visage of an older person, of a sage, he doesn't have that effect on you. So although they knew he was 18, he's the same person as yesterday. Well, what's his presence? His presence is that's what it's all about. The father and a child, what does a child have to respect their father? For many reasons. A person learns from a person who he believes he has what to learn from. But if you see another person as a peer, you don't see him as the source of what you should learn from that person. So that's what he was saying. If the father and son look age-wise the same, and a lad looks the same as an older person, what's going to be? They don't give that reverence and that respect. And as a result of that, what happens? Whatever lesson you could learn from that elderly person, you don't learn. Because you see, you're on a peer level. But when you see he's a different level, then we talk about the future because there's what to learn, and we can speak about advancing existence. That's the way I understand it. Chinuch writes that there's a mitzvah of Dr. Bnei Zokim, that you have to acknowledge an elderly person. The person's old, you have to acknowledge him. You have to respect him. So the Chinuch says, why? Even the person himself is not educated, is not a scholar. Just being a sage, being an older person, gives him a certain characteristic of a sage. Why? Because the lessons of life teach a person wisdom. A person lives long years, there's what to learn from life. So that person has a value that you're able to draw certain lessons from him that he can teach you. That's the chinuch. So even Zoken Ashmoy, he's a person who's totally not educated, nothing. But being through the thick and thick of life, seeing so much, he has what to offer. But if he looks like you look, age-wise, the outer appearance is the same, where are we going? We're going nowhere. you're overlooking something which is invaluable. By taking on that elderly look, that older look, now the young person has a choice. He's able to draw certain lessons from that older person. Age-wise, if a person is knowledgeable in Torah, there's a mitzvah to acknowledge him. Because ein zikna ela chochma. Zikna, being an elder is based on knowledge. And if you have chochma, you're an elder. Now, the question is, and there's a mitzvah to acknowledge him. And therefore, it's ruled in Shulchan Aruch, based on the Gemara and the Rambam, that if you have a person's Talmud Chacham comes within your 4 cubits, you have to lift yourself. You have to stand, lift yourself, to acknowledge that somebody special came into your proximity. What's the point of that? Because if you don't, he looks like a young person. But if you acknowledge him, that means he's not an ordinary person. The moment people take notice, he's not ordinary, evidently they say, there's what to talk about. Once there's what to talk about, people now will see that person as a source of what? As a learning source. You're able to learn from that person. Because people are giving him that level of value, acknowledgement. So if a person is older, his outer appearance makes it clear that he has value, and Torah says, therefore, we have to acknowledge him. He's just not an old fool. Even the old fool has something what to learn from. No, you get to learn, if he's old and yet he's a fool, so you see that age doesn't necessarily mean anything. Or the other way, because he's the older person, as the Chinuch says, he has life's lessons to teach you.
Morning, Rabbi.